What's up, Coachable family? Welcome back to the Coachable podcast. I'm your host, Tori Gordon, and today I'm in studio with Thais Gibson, a PhD candidate with over 15 certifications and modalities, including CBT, NLP, somatic experiencing, internal family systems, and more. I'm so excited to have her here because I've actually known about her work for several years since I've gotten into the personal development space, and she is known for her created body of work called the Gibson Integrated Attachment Theory, which is something we're going to be diving into today's episode, learning all about how your attachment style is impacting your current and past relationships and future relationships as well, how we can become more securely attached. So I'm excited to dive in with you. Thanks so much for being here. How's it going? Welcome to Vegas.
Really good. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you. It's been a blast so far.
Yeah. So you have worked with over 30,000 students in the personal development school. How long has personal development school been around now?
So we actually launched the beginning of 2020. We sort of had like a soft launch end of 2019, but prior to that, I ran a client-based practice for like 8 years. So I was really in the space for quite a long time. And how PDS sort of came about is that I had a 2-year wait list for clients, and it was like, hey, how do I like package this in some sort of way? Because people were getting frustrated at me that the wait list was so long, and it was like, this isn't like a very good solution.
Sure.
So over time, we put YouTube content out a little bit, and then from there packaged it into courses, and then made everything more available to people.
Yeah. I mean, I've been seeing your YouTube and online social media content for years, and you do this really, really well. You know how to speak to your audience. You know the questions they have, especially when it comes to relationships and attachment theory. Let's talk about your unique approach to this, because you've got something that you've created called the Gibson Integrated Attachment Theory, which is a framework that connects traditional attachment theory with empirical findings in developmental psychology. What does that mean? Break that down for us, and how is it different or in addition to traditional attachment theory? Can you kind of walk us through what that looks like?
Yeah, so there's the traditional body of work, for anybody who's not as familiar as you are, of attachment theory. It was John Bowlby's work, and this has been studied for decades now. And essentially what they found is there are 4 major attachment styles. So for anybody who's not familiar, there's the securely attached style. Essentially what you'll see is the securely attached child grows up in a household where there's a lot of approach-oriented behaviors from the caregivers, meaning that if a child is crying or expressing emotions, the caregivers will be attuned, they'll be present, they'll be able to go towards the child and support them. And as that child ages, they will talk with the child about their needs, they'll negotiate about boundaries. And a lot of people would say to me when I was running my practice, well, Thais, like if I have a young child, I can't just meet all their needs all the time. Like what if they want candy at 11 p.m.? And the answer to that is it's not about having to meet all the child's needs if the child's needs are not in their own best interest and they don't know yet. It's actually about being able to go to the child and say, hey, honey, I know you want candy, but you're not going to sleep well. So, eat your breakfast and lunch and dinner tomorrow. And after dinner, you can have a little bit of candy if you go to bed on time. And so it's more like being able to honor and validate that the child has needs. And so in doing that, this child grows up and they go, okay, well, I can rely on people. I can trust that people care about me. I feel worthy of my emotions and of expressing myself. I feel safe expressing. And that child will grow up to feel more confident in relationships and have an easier time bonding with other people. And so securely attached children tend to, have the best success rate as adults in relationships statistically. So that's like the secure attachment. And then there's 3 insecurely attached styles from John Bowlby's work. There's the anxious preoccupied, who tends to have a lot of inconsistency in childhood. So they have either real abandonment or a lot of perceived abandonment, meaning that if somebody grows up in a household where, let's say, they have really loving caregivers, but those parents are working all the time and they're constantly with their grandparents, that like inconsistency of love, love, love taken away, love taken away can create this sort of perceived abandonment. And the subconscious mind is programmed through repetition plus emotion. So the repeated perceived abandonment conditions a child to constantly fear that as an adult. And so they are the ones as adults that tend to struggle with like abandonment issues, fear of being alone. They're very sensitive to what people think of them. And they tend to fear, not getting approval or not feeling good enough. So that's our anxious preoccupied. Then we have on the far other end, the dismissive avoidant attachment style. And the dismissive avoidant tends to have a lot of childhood emotional neglect. And the interesting thing about this is that childhood emotional neglect often flies under the radar, particularly for men, because they can grow up in a household where like the household's secure and stable, but there's nobody speaking about emotions. There's nobody saying, hey, how are you? Or if that child is expressing emotions, they may even go so far as to say, don't cry, don't be a baby, toughen up, man up.
Mm-hmm.
And that messaging causes this child to go, okay, this part of me, which we all biologically have, this part of me is wrong or bad. So I need to just like push it away, disconnect from it. And they don't like that level of vulnerability, needing to rely on somebody and not getting the need met. So as an adult, they adapt and they're like, I don't ever want to rely on somebody so much again. I don't want to feel this vulnerable again.
Yep.
So dismissive avoidance grow up and they tend to fear commitment. So they'll be very like they may attach to somebody a little bit, but as soon as there's a real attachment bond built, that's when they'll sort of run the other direction. So that's DA. And then last but not least, there's fearful avoidant attachment style. And this is what I was growing up. And essentially fearful avoidance grew up in a lot of chaos. So that can be that there's like alcoholism in the family. It can be addiction. It can be a lot of fighting, a really bad divorce, a lot of just walking on eggshells.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fearful avoidant grows up having conflicting ideas about the same thing, which is love. So they go, okay, love is I have beautiful moments with love and connection, but I also have really scary moments with love and connection, or I feel in turmoil. So they'll sort of be very hot and cold in relationships as adults. They want love and want connection. And then when somebody gets too close, they push away and they give those conflicting messages. So that's the sort of long summary of John Bowlby's work. But when I was working with clients, originally actually I wasn't even working with people in my practice on attachment styles. I was working with people on like learning their needs, learning to communicate their needs, learning their boundaries, learning to recondition their core wounds, these fears of abandonment, these fears of being trapped or helpless or powerless. And so what was funny is that when I circled back to attachment theory, I had traditionally learned about it in school. There was like this missing part where nobody taught you how to heal your attachment style and become secure. Mm-hmm. And your attachment style you're not born with it. It's through conditioning. So we can leverage those same principles of conditioning to reprogram the subconscious mind. So for me, I started realizing that all these things I was working on with clients, their core wounds, their needs, their emotional patterns, their boundaries, their communication, I was like, oh, these all package right into unique attachment styles. And each attachment style has like the same types of needs, the same types of boundary issues. So I started just focusing on helping people become securely attached and saw amazing results in reconditioning that. And so that was sort of how we created integrated attachment theory, was to take the traditional body of work and say, well, hold on a minute here. The traditional body of work tells you about like the temperaments and some things to expect. It doesn't tell you how to heal. There's a whole missing set of pieces there. So that's sort of where all of that was born from.
So let me make sure I'm tracking with you and getting this right. So for instance, if I were to identify, and maybe for those listening in the audience, whether you've gone through some kind of attachment quiz or something to kind of self-identify what your style might be. Now, do we all have one specific style, or can our styles change over time?
It's a great question. So we're born with we're born with no attachment style in particular. It actually develops between the ages of 0 to 2, as early as it is. Mm-hmm. But we have neuroplasticity. So our attachment style can change very much. Like we can come from a secure household, and then there can be a terrible divorce. And then maybe at 8 years old, somebody now becomes anxious or fearful avoidant. And so that can change over time, but also we can grow up and we could be maybe anxious, preoccupied, get into a relationship, let's say, for example, with a narcissist, and then become a fearful avoidant on the other side of it. So essentially your attachment style is born of how the subconscious is programmed, which is anything we're repeatedly exposed to. So repetition plus emotion. And that's how we get conditioned. And so if we, by the same token, if we grow up anxious, and then we're in a very secure relationship and we're also willing to do some of that inner work and follow that secure person's lead, we can also become secure. Mm-hmm. So everybody has a primary attachment style. We can have like secondary features as well. Like I know for myself, for example, I was fearful avoidant, but I was like leaning more into my anxious side. But people can be fearful avoidant, leaning very dismissive, or somebody can be secure with a little bit of anxious tendencies. But our primary attachment style is really the biggest impactor of our relationships and personality.
Right. So when I think about like anxious, for instance, earlier you said that there might be, this fear of abandonment along that like couples with that anxious attachment style, maybe because of the inconsistency they experienced in childhood. And maybe that abandonment is the core wound of somebody who has an anxious attachment style. Is that one of the components in helping people heal, is identifying what that core wound is within the style itself?
Absolutely. So the first step is awareness with any of this attachment stuff, because I think one of the first things people will see and just get value from as simple as this is that we tend to project from our perception. So we think everybody is as we are. So somebody who's anxious, for example, if they're dating somebody who's dismissive, The anxious person never wants space in their relationship, or very rarely needs space. So when somebody wants space from them, it's like for them, they think of it through the lens of, well, if I would want space from somebody, I wouldn't be that interested in them. So they really personalize somebody else's behaviors.
Yep.
So when we start having the awareness that like, oh wait, everybody has different programming than we do, and people's behaviors are not always about us, they're actually about them. That first step unlocks a lot of, momentum in terms of not personalizing things, feeling like we can understand. And also when we understand people, we have an easier time empathizing, right? We can lose empathy when we don't have that understanding.
Sure.
So that's the first step. But then the second biggest step, and it's where I focus with people first, is we have to identify our core wounds. So we have to recondition them, and we have to be able to actually like change this idea. So every time we get imprinted by something through that repetition and emotion that we were talking about, let's say the abandonment fear, for example, we have to actually be able to change our brain to stop seeing everything through that lens, because your subconscious mind is like the lens you see the world through. If you have abandonment wounds, if somebody doesn't call you back, your mind's going to go right to like, oh, I'm about to be abandoned. Their feelings are changing.
Yep.
Whereas if you're dismissive avoidant and you don't have abandonment wounds in the same way, then if somebody doesn't call you back, you're like, oh, they were busy.
Right.
Or something came up, or I'll talk to them later. So we tend to jump to the conclusions and project our wounds onto our relationship. And that's really triggering. And it's also really hard. It's like we make relationships much more difficult by doing that. So the first big step that I take with people is helping to identify. And you were mentioning the attachment style quiz. So we have a free attachment style quiz on our website. And you can actually go through, and then it will tell you your output of like exactly your core wounds for your attachment style. And then it will take you through, here are some of the big steps that you have to take in order to come out the other side, right? And so, but at PDS, we'll really focus on the reconditioning of the core wounds. And then we also go into learning our needs. Like there's a lot of, I'm sure you've heard of like Gary Chapman's 5 love languages.
Yes.
And we give love through our love languages, but we also give love through our needs. And an example of this, I'm sure you can relate to this. When I was on my own spiritual journey and personal growth journey, I would be at Christmas time, every Christmas, buying people like seminar tickets, personal growth books, like thinking like I was giving the best, most powerful gift ever.
Yep.
And then people like wouldn't go, or they wouldn't read the book. I'd be like, what do you mean? But I was loving through my needs, not understanding that, hey, everybody has unique needs, and people also give and receive love through their own needs. And so that's another big part, is like when we can understand that each attachment style also has unique needs, we can also like see somebody for who they are, not see somebody as we are. And it allows us to really heal that dynamic and improve the quality of our relationships too.
Well, what's exciting is you're saying that even though we might have been conditioned in a certain way, it's almost like an old dog can learn new tricks. So we can still recondition, rewire the brain so that we can move towards that secure attachment. Can you briefly explain the 6 components of IAT and their significance in achieving and moving towards secure attachments in our relationships?
Yes, absolutely. So essentially, and this is what came from working in practice, is I was always working with people on their core wounds. So that's the first biggest thing. Like we have to know our core wounds and we have to reprogram them. That is like life-changing in and of itself, because to not have that abandonment fear, or to not be jumping to the conclusion, like for me as a fearful avoidant, I was always like not trusting. I was thinking, oh, somebody's going to like betray me or lie. And I'm always, looking to read between the lines on things. And like, that's such an uncomfortable way to live. And interestingly enough, like, I've been with my husband now, we've been together for about 9 years. And, I never trusted somebody before that relationship, because I hadn't done that inner work until a couple of years prior to him. And the relationship like difference is night and day, like to trust versus to never be able to trust. Like I can't even believe how painful it was to live like that in the past.
Sure.
So healing those core wounds is like so valuable. And then we go into the second big component is the needs, like we're talking about. So it's, for an anxious preoccupied, they really need in their relationships acceptance. They need validation. They need to feel like they are reassured. They need certainty. And when we can understand that about our partner, we can give to them in the way that they receive love in exactly the way that they're needing. And then, for a dismissive avoidant, for example, they really need empathy. They want support. They also really want a sense of unconditional acceptance. So when we can understand like each of our sort of, it's almost like a love language through our needs, then we can give in that meaningful way. So we do core wounds, we do needs, we do emotional regulation, which is the embodiment work. Some of us can be really disconnected from our bodies because of attachment trauma and because of constantly sort of walking on eggshells or being on high alert. So we do a lot of like, nervous system regulation work, simple things that go a really long way to get us more regulated and back in our bodies again. So we do core wounds, needs, emotional regulation work. And then we do the really easy stuff after, which is just communicating that with others, learning our boundaries. And then as a result, we have a sixth component, which is changing our coping behaviors. So, if I'm anxious, let's say, for example, I may call you, many times in a row if I can't get a hold of you. And, we learn that, wait, that's not always going to be something that gets your needs met. That might actually push somebody away.
Yep.
So we recondition some of those coping mechanisms.
I love all of those. And it gives people really a framework. That's exactly what it is, a framework for how to heal instead of staying in the awareness phase. So many people in personal development, and even those, I've experienced this a lot with my clients who've done a lot of talk therapy, they're very well aware of their challenges, of the stuck places that they keep bumping up against, of some of their patterns. They can talk about it with precision. They can, they've made the unconscious conscious. However, oftentimes they get stuck in that phase of being able to talk about it and think about it and process it, but never move from the logical mind into the body and actually shift some of those patterns. So I'm hearing that obviously the embodiment work is very crucial outside of just becoming aware. And then there's other components around understanding your needs, your boundaries, and then your coping strategies. This is really important too, because by default, we will tend to, even if a situation or a person triggers us. For instance, I'm thinking about a moment for me where, because I tend to be more of the anxious attachment style at times. And so when I look back on a lot of the challenging moments in my relationships, it's that feeling of you're going to go away, you're going to leave me, or there's something like if I can't get a hold of you, something bad's happening.
Yes.
And in the past, before I had this awareness, I could, it was just a panic that would come over me, right? And then as I started to do the work on myself, I realized, okay, I can start to identify what is this feeling in my body that I'm having, and that's the indicator. And I can start to understand the sensations, the feelings, the emotions that are present with that. And now I can make a new choice.
Yes.
Jim Quick was, I don't know if you know him, was just on the show yesterday, and he was talking about, he said, life is the C between B and D, which is B is birth, D is death, and C is choice. And that's where our power lies, is in our choice to, are we going to do the same thing we've always done and go to the same coping mechanism, which may be being, I'm going to call you 100 times, or am I going to notice that something's happening internally, take responsibility for it. I can see that this is playing out in a certain similar way. And how do I want to respond from a place of personal empowerment versus being on the emotional roller coaster and letting it take me for a ride? Is that fair?
That is absolutely fair. And that's a beautiful, beautiful point. And I completely agree with that. And I also want to kind of take it a step further, which is that, like, so as somebody, I went through at a young age, as sort of an analogy for all of this. I was an athlete in university, and I had knee surgery in my 10th grade year, and I got addicted to opiates. And I went through like a 6-year struggle with pretty much daily opioid use for the vast majority of the time, and went to inpatient rehab, outpatient rehab, tried a lot of different things. And I was fairly high functioning despite all of that. And I was in a psychology class in first year, and somebody said to me, oh, the conscious mind can't outwill or overpower the subconscious mind. And to me, as somebody who had gone through this, and it's kind of like exactly sort of synonymous to what you're saying, this struggle of like, this is the last time. I'm not doing this again. I'm going to get clean. I'm going to, go to rehab. I'm going to, and you tell yourself all these things that you're going to choose. But then my subconscious mind was like, no, I want to heal pain. I want to numb pain, right? Not heal pain.
Yeah.
I want to numb pain. And so, the choice is there, but we can actually, in that moment, somebody who's doing as much work as you're doing and is on their journey can maybe have that conscious choice to choose something different, but also it can be really hard. And
Totally.
so one of my sort of like bones to pick with like the traditional Western model of talk therapy is like, well, we can consciously know everything, but we can't always consciously choose because sometimes our subconscious is so powerful. And so, and research shows that our subconscious and unconscious mind collectively are responsible for 95 to 97% of our thoughts, our beliefs, emotions. And so for me, it was like, well, how do you change that? And that's where like there's tools that we can actually leverage so that it's not just about the conscious choice in the moment, because that sometimes takes a lot of willpower.
Totally.
But also we can have the conscious awareness, and then we can couple that with actually reconditioning those patterns so we don't even have to feel, because it's not just embodied in that moment, having the conscious awareness and then saying, okay, I'm not going to call. It's actually, no, I'm going to recondition the wounds that's calling me to even feel like that to begin with. And that's root cause. And for me, doing that work at a much deeper level is the only way I got out of addiction long term. So.
Yeah, that's such a powerful story. And so it sounds like the end goal is, how do we get our subconscious and unconscious mind on the side of our conscious mind that's programmed to make the choices we want it to versus working against it all the time. I'd love to hear more about your personal story, because this is so profound and like really powerful, because I can think, regardless of if it's opiates or social media or booze or vape or whatever it might be, like we all deal with our addictions of our own kind, right? You were talking about what are your coping strategies, because it's innate in us to want to avoid pain and pursue pleasure. We are working against the primal mind that's here to survive. And it's like, pain is a threat. Let's not feel pain, right? But the crux of it is, healing requires you to go into your pain to feel your pain, right? Because so many of us would like, how can I bypass this? Can I not? But the treasure you seek is in the cave you fear to enter. So I'd love to hear more about, what were those strategies like that you had? What were those methods that you applied in order to really start to reprogram your subconscious to help it find a new default response?
Yes. Okay. So great question. So this is like, it's funny because I'll share this and then it actually kind of plugs into like all areas of life. Like it plugs into attachment styles. It plugs into so many things. But for me, one of the first things is I learned about that in the psychology class. And that was like this earth shattering moment for me of going, okay, I have to learn about how the subconscious mind works. So I actually went into like hypnosis with some of my early like certifications that I did. But I started just reading about the subconscious and how we get programmed. And so the first thing is that neural pathways are like muscles. They atrophy over time. So if we stop using them, they die out. So if we stop refeeding the beast, right, then it eventually sort of dies out over time. So the first thing for me was like, I have to sit down and I have to see what's going on in there, right? I have to become aware of my thoughts. So I started meditating to sort of see, because they say, okay, these are our subconscious autopilot thoughts. And I remember my first time in meditation, I sat down and I was like, I had the worst internal dialogue. Like it was so cruel. I was so mean to myself. And it was because like our internal dialogue is often our internalized dialogue from childhood.
Yep.
And I was constantly being modeled, my parents fighting and being so harsh in how they spoke to each other and so cruel. And so I just soaked that all up and sponged it up, and that became my internal dialogue. So I remember sitting in meditation and going, like sitting down and being like, okay, I have to witness my thoughts and going, you can't do this. You can't do anything. You're never going to get sober. This is a waste of your time. You can't even sit. And then I was like, oh my gosh, no wonder I am trying to numb myself all day. I'm trying to numb myself from this.
My own abuse.
Yes. And so it was like, okay, like if somebody was following me around all day, speaking to me the way I speak to myself, like I would be running from them. So I'm running from me. And so the first part is that we have to be aware of like what that internal dialogue is. And it comes from our core wounds. And so I started being like, okay, how do I recondition this internal dialogue? And so to sort of simplify it, you know, when we have our core wounds, one of the easiest ways to reprogram is through something called autosuggestion. And so you sit in a meditative state or any state that produces alpha brainwaves. You're actually producing alpha brainwaves for the first hour that you wake up and the last hour before you go to bed, but also after meditation, breath work, a deep state of relaxation. So you sit, you get into alpha state. And then what you want to do is you want to take whatever your big core wound is. And let's just say for argument's sake, it's I'm not good enough, or I will be abandoned or whatever it might be. But let's just say not good enough. Okay, what's the opposite? I am good enough. And then the really funny thing is that your conscious mind speaks language, but your subconscious does not. So if I say to you, like, whatever you do not think of the pink elephant.
Right.
Like, too bad you thought of the pink elephant. And so what happens is your conscious mind hears, but your subconscious speaks in the language of emotion and imagery. So your subconscious, when you say pink elephant, it sees the pink elephant, right? And so what we have to do is we can't just use like affirmations. We can't just say, I am good enough, because then we're tackling a subconscious problem with a conscious mind issue, and we're not getting there, right? It's so hard to get results. So what you do is I started looking for like, okay, I read this about the subconscious, and then I was like, well, where do we have emotion and imagery? How do we leverage that? And actually it's in all of our memories. So if you sit and you say like your favorite childhood memory, you'd probably close your eyes and you'd smile. I would see this with clients all the time. They sit and they start talking about it and their body language changes. So our memory is a container of, guess what? Emotion and imagery. Mm-hmm. So what we do is we take like, I am not good enough, for example, and we say, I am good enough. And we come up with 10 pieces of evidence or 10 pieces of memory. So you would think of, okay, the time that you graduated from X place and walked across the stage, and you would visualize it, because now you're speaking to your subconscious. So we're now using the conscious to speak to the subconscious. And so what we do, it's really simple, is once you understand those principles, it's like, okay, we take the core wound, the abandonment wound, the not good enough, the betrayal, the trapped, whichever core wounds we have, we find the opposite, and we find 10 pieces of evidence to oppose it. And then we just have to keep that repetition for 21 days. Just 21 days to really strengthen new neural pathways. And so over 21 days, people are letting go of big core wounds. And we can write out 10 new pieces every day, or we can just record it into our phone and re-listen to it and feel about it. But then we're actually getting the visualization of the emotion, the imagery. And now we're getting our conscious mind to engage with our subconscious. And this is one of the big first ways we can start to recondition these core wounds.
I've never heard it put like that before. And I love that practice of first identifying the core wound, which for those listening, as you kind of walked us through the different attachment styles, are there specific core wounds that go with each? Because I would love to give people an example.
Absolutely.
If they could identify, okay, their core wound, or for using it as an example, and then let's find the opposite. Let's just take people through a little bit of a simulation of that, I think, so that they could really ground it and practice it at home.
Absolutely. So the anxious preoccupied's big core wounds are, I will be abandoned or alone, tend to be sort of hand in hand. Then they're also sensitive to feeling not good enough, and they'll put all that kind of pressure on themselves.
Yep.
Then they're also sensitive to feeling rejected, excluded, and disliked. So those are their big ones, right? And you may even notice, like as somebody who said, even like exclusion stuff can really sting in your body. Like you really feel that. So those are the big ones. And so what we do is we oppose it. So I'm not good enough. I am good enough. I am rejected. I am accepted. I am unloved can also be there sometimes. I am loved. And then if you're looking at the other dynamics of feeling like alone, okay, I'm together,
I'm connected.
Excluded, included, exactly, abandoned, connected. So those are some of the opposites. And then we're just looking for proof. And the really big like secret ingredient is the more specific you get, the more emotion you evoke. The more emotion you evoke, the stronger the programming becomes. And a really good example of this is like, let's say, God forbid, let's say Bob gets into a car accident. Bob that day got into his car, feels totally safe. Bob the next day gets into his car, because the emotion was so strong in that moment, it actually can create an immediate imprint of feeling unsafe. And so, I am unsafe. We can do I am safe is the opposite. But the stronger the emotion, the more we can evoke. So if you think of feeling, connected, the most connected memories you can really get in there and feel about and write about and get specific, the more you feel and the faster we're reprogramming.
I can think of them right now.
Yeah. And you can feel it in your body a little bit just without even like really sitting in it. So that's anxious preoccupied.
That's powerful.
And then dismissive avoidant, their big fears tend to be, or core wounds tend to be feeling trapped, helpless, or powerless. So especially like, in relationship dynamics. So trapped, free, helpless is actually helped or supported. Powerless is empowered. I don't like to say powerful, because it's not about power over others. It's about power over ourselves, right? And then the other even bigger ones are, they actually have a big feeling of unsafety, especially around vulnerability and connection. So I am safe. And then they have a big defective core wound. So dismissive avoidance, because of childhood neglect, they don't have the capacity as a child to say, oh, my caregivers are emotionally unavailable. So instead, they tend to think, okay, there must be something wrong with me. And so they're actually, they tend to feel very sensitive to criticism, even though they're very stoic and wouldn't show it. So the opposite of that would be, okay, I am acceptable, right? I am defective, I am acceptable, or I am normal. And so those tend to be the big places to do reprogramming. And then also they can feel like I am weak if I am vulnerable. So the opposite is I am strong.
Wow.
So those are the big ones for DAs. fearful avoidance. I find that sometimes I was fearful avoidant, if anyone's listening. It's not as terrible as it sounds, but they have the core wounds of both, first of all, but they also tend to have big betrayal core wounds and unsafety core wounds. And so betrayal is I can trust or I can see loyalty in people. And then you would do the same thing for the abandoned side, the alone, excluded, but also the avoidance side, trapped, helpless, powerless kind of core wounds.
Yeah.
And again, doing that reprogramming, you can do 2 or 3 core wounds at a time and like 21 days. And I want to stress that like it is a little bit of work for 21 days.
Sure.
You have to have a bit of a routine for 5-10 minutes in the morning, but like the reward on the other side of that to drop these like stories and narratives. And like, you know, you were saying earlier when you feel anxious or have felt anxious in the past, that's a trauma response.
Yep.
Like that's not something to be taken lightly. And I feel like we judge ourselves for our, you know, wounds and our stuff, but it's like, no, that's a trauma response coming up in your body. It's requiring support. So, you know, the more we can just plug into doing that work in the morning, the more we'll see a lot of that momentum as a result.
Yeah. I mean, this is such a practical method that people can apply right now and get real results. And I love how you put the emphasis on the more emotion or more specific you can make that memory, the more emotion you're going to feel, which to me, it gave me this imagery of like a really strong Wi-Fi connection.
Yes.
You know, when you have a really strong Wi-Fi connection, you have that connection in the neural pathways that's like moving that information is going to move so much more rapidly and freely than if the less emotion you have, it's like harder to, or take more time to actually get through. So it's like, yeah, how can I make that feeling and that emotion really dense and like tangible for myself?
Yeah,
So
I love that
powerful.
analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is great because we've been able to identify what are the different attachment styles, what are some of the core wounds of each of the attachment style, what is the opposite of that, how can we start to identify what is actual need that I have to feel, I need to feel safe or I need to feel worthy or loved or whatever it is, and how we can start to reprogram it. Now, is there any other method that I would love to know that you used when you were trying to
overcome addiction?
overcome addiction and reprogram the subconscious?
Great question. So first of all, that was the big first place, which
Yeah.
was like, I need to make sure that I'm reconditioning these core wounds that are the result, because I have this acronym I share with people. It's like BTEA, and it's not always so simple, but it's like our beliefs lead to thoughts. You know, so if I believe I'm not good enough and I go into like some kind of social event with a bunch of people, I might start saying, oh, I'm not smart enough, I'm not interesting enough, I'm not funny enough, you know. So our beliefs will create these patterns of thought. So reprogramming core wounds takes it out at the root. And then, you know, the TEA part, so beliefs to thoughts lead to emotions. So when we start thinking those thoughts, how do we feel? We feel nervous, we feel afraid. And then neuroscience has actually proven that every single decision we make is actually based on our emotional state. So some people, especially our dismissive avoidance, will be like, no, I make logical thought, you know, decisions and actions. No, we are just, you know, still making these emotional decisions at the tipping point and then quick to rationalize through logic. So when we can control our beliefs, it actually has an impact on our thoughts, our emotions, and our actions to follow. So that's the first sort of major part. And then the other really interesting part from an addiction point of view is after doing a lot of that in your reconditioning, the other part is that every single thing that we do, period, is because our subconscious mind sees more benefits than drawbacks. So for me,
so there's a bigger payoff than a cost.
Yes, exactly. And so for me, addiction was meeting a need, right? So, you know, opiates specifically were meeting a need. It was trying to help me get comfort and safety from pain and to feel more safe within myself. And so I grew up in a dynamic where I was like constantly walking on eggshells, constantly in sympathetic nervous system, too upregulated all the time. So, okay, now opiates are helping me down regulate, relax, get comfortable, feel a sense of numbness, like it was safer to be in my world. And so the inner dialogue is very helpful, but then my subconscious still has this tie, right? To say, okay, well, this is doing more good than harm. So then there's another reprogramming tool. There's lots of different ones, but this is one I really focused on, which is I had to rewire those emotional associations to opiates. And I had to do something called cost benefit work. So I had to sit down, and same thing, repetition and emotion reprograms. So I had to sit down, and every day I would write out all of the costs of opiates, all the things that how they tore up my relationships, couldn't let me be myself, you know, repetition and emotion, and then listen back to that every single day, rewriting, feeling about the costs. And then I had to say, okay, well, what needs do these meet? And like we said, the comfort, the safety within myself, I had to come up with new strategies to get those needs met so my mind could rest.
Mm-hmm.
And so I came up with new strategies to get the needs met. And then I had to write out the benefits of those new strategies. So now my mind is getting reconditioned to see more benefits over here in doing this and more cost to using as a result of trying to get my needs met. So when I did that, it wasn't like perfectly smooth sailing. Like I definitely had, this period of time within that about 8-month period that I was getting sober, where I relapsed a couple of times and went backwards. But, and I'm not recommending everybody just try that at home.
Sure.
Some people need to be in rehab and those programs may work the best for them. But for me, I tried it and I felt stuck there. So for me, I was like, I'm going to do the subconscious work. And through reconditioning my core wounds, learning my needs, learning to meet them in the relationship to myself in healthier ways, and then doing that cost benefit work, I would say those were the 3 biggest things that really drove results for me.
Ooh. So I'd love to know, because starting to identify what your needs are is such a foundational point for people. And I know even for myself, when I started to become aware of what my needs were, it was like all of a sudden I could see why I was having so many challenges and why I was acting out and having the behaviors, like you were saying, as a byproduct of my beliefs and thoughts and feelings, right? And then how I was acting as a result of all of that. And then the results that came, which I maybe didn't necessarily like and wanted to change. Okay, well, if I want to change my results, I got to start at the beginning with my beliefs and my thoughts and then my feelings. So given that the importance of understanding needs, and for you specifically, which so many people I know can relate to, which is this feeling of safety, internal safety that you are using in order to achieve, how does one create a new internalized feeling of safety that they've never felt before, except while using some kind of other substance or some kind of other alternative coping mechanism to achieve that state?
Yes. Great question. Really good question. So there's 2 things. First of all, we remove our personal sort of blockers to that space of safety. So for me, that space of safety, blocking it was all of my internal dialogue. So I couldn't feel safe with myself because I was walking around verbally abusing myself all day. So for me, it's always like I say to people, before you pour the safety into the bucket, you have to fill the hole. And so we have to find out what are those blockers that are stopping us from getting there. So that was number 1. Number 2, we have to recondition our nervous system. So for people who aren't as familiar, we have parasympathetic nervous system mode and sympathetic. So parasympathetic is like rest, digest, repair mode, and sympathetic is fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, like chronic people pleasing mode. And for me, I was constantly in like fight or flight mode for sure. And you cannot feel truly safe within yourself when you're chronically there. And so when I first like reprogrammed that internal dialogue and did a lot of work on core wounds, then I felt better. And I felt less triggered, because part of why we're even getting into sympathetic is also because we're carrying those core wounds to begin with. But also then our subconscious mind is used to, like our subconscious mind really wants familiarity because it equates it to safety and survival. So then, even though I'm now feeling better, I noticed myself as I was sort of transitioning out of the core wounds, I was still in this like space where, although I wasn't as triggered by things any longer, I would put myself in like stressful situations still, where I'd be like rushing, or I'd be, these things. And I would feel this kind of like thrill, Dr. Joe Dispenza, I'm sure you've heard, like talks about how we can be addicted to our neurochemistry of stress. And for sure, like I was still trying to almost find that familiarity in different ways. So I was like, well, I have to retrain my body to get safe. And so for me, that became meditation. It was a huge thing that I just like really lived by, because meditation, you're getting comfortable being in parasympathetic. You're having to like re-regulate. I started doing breath work. I started doing this non-existent tool that I sort of made up that I would call it being. I think we often as human beings get so far into doing mode. And so when I was having like a busy day, or I come home from like a busy work day, I would go into my bed and I would be like, I'm going to practice being. And I would go into my bed, no electronics, no distractions. And I would just lay down in like cozy clothes and just like sort of put my hand on my heart and just practice like coming back into my body if I felt like I was disconnecting. And so having a morning routine of meditation and then an evening routine of the same thing. And for the record, not everybody has to do like all of these things. You can really pick one and that's enough. But I would do a morning and an evening, and then I would do like a post-work come back into my body kind of thing, because I would very easily dissociate from myself, not in extreme ways, but dissociation is much more common than people think, in mild ways. And so I would come back home, I would do that, and I was teaching my body that it's safe to be here with myself in my body and be present. And that for me was like what drove that last sort of big piece home. And that's where, yeah, I did work on the reprogramming of I am unsafe, but then I coupled that with nervous system
Yeah,
regulation.
now I can feel that in my body versus knowing that in my mind, because sometimes that's such a struggle for people. They're like, I know cognitively that I'm safe. Like logically, like me getting on this plane right now is much more safer than me getting in my car every day. Like, because I've had a client that really struggled with this fear of flying,
Yeah.
and she would understand, like, I am safe, but my body feels out of control, right?
Exactly.
And so that is so powerful. I'm glad you shared all of that, because it couples with, I don't think high levels of stress is so normalized in our culture
Yes.
that we don't even realize when we have disconnected from self or left self or abandoned or betrayed self. And as we start to practice these things, for me, it started with yoga and meditation as well. Yoga was just a practice of slowing my body down in more intentional ways and actually feeling, well, what does it feel like to make this tiny little subtle shift? Oh, I feel actually a little bit more strong in this posture. I feel a little bit more grounded when I move. It just started to illuminate these micro shifts in my body, but it also showed me that there were micro shifts that could happen in my mind and these other areas of my life, which was really important. I'd like to shift into, because we're talking about relationships, we're talking about attachment styles, but what happens when two people get into a relationship with each other and their attachment styles kind of rub up against each other and create that friction? So how do people navigate their relationship attachment style as well as their partners when we start to move into partnership?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you know what's so cool about this, and this is one of my favorite things about all of this work, is that exactly what we need to heal within ourselves, our partner is going to show us. So, exactly the work that we need to do for the relationship to work, if we're willing, is also the work we need to do to heal ourselves. So, they really go hand in hand. And it's funny because you'll see, for example, like the anxious, preoccupied person with a dismissive avoidant, they often pair up together, right? Opposite ends of the continuum. But like the anxious, preoccupied, as an example, in order to heal with their DA partner, they need to learn to maintain their sense of self. They need to not just go full speed to codependency. They need to learn to meet their own needs. They need to learn to stand behind their boundaries, communicate what they need to their partner. All of those things are exactly what they need to heal themselves, but also the like prerequisites to make the relationship work. So we follow the same format for all attachment styles. It's that I use an acronym for IAT, Integrated Attachment Theory, which is CNEBCB. So C is our core wounds, N is our needs, E is our emotional regulation, that nervous system work that we were talking about. And so that's the self work, right? That's the work that if we do it at the root, it's really hard to go communicate to your partner what you need if you haven't done your needs work first. It's really hard to, overcome and have a healthy communication about a core wound that you have that might be coming up if you're 10 out of 10 triggered about it. So we do that inner work first, and we do the core wounds work, the needs work, the emotional regulation. And then BCB stands for our boundaries, our communication, our coping behaviors, right? B for behaviors. And so what that then does is it takes that inner work we've now solidified, and then we bring it into partnership. So we say, okay, here are my boundaries now that I've learned them. Here's how I can communicate to you that I know my core wounds, and this is what comes up for me. And what's beautiful about this, and honestly, like my favorite thing, is that when we do this work, there's if you ever heard of the work of Dr. Susan Johnson, she talks about the 5 stages of relationships. And what I've done is sort of separate that out into 6 stages. So we have our dating stage, which is really our vetting phase. Like, do we like each other? Are we a good fit for each other? Are there non-negotiables at play? What are our standards? So there's a dating stage, then the honeymoon stage. Then we have the power struggle stage, which every relationship goes through. And this is the part that's so cool, is the power struggle stage, the rite of passage to move beyond it, is to essentially learn to be vulnerable, to show yourself, and to be accepted. And what it does is it takes this like dating honeymoon conditionally based love, where we're showing ourselves with conditions and with the mask on. And the power struggle stage gets a really bad rap. Everybody's like, the power struggle stage, because statistically most people break up there.
Yep.
But the rite of passage is to go from more conditionally based love to more unconditionally based love, because you say, hey, this is my core wound. I'm working on it. And sometimes I do have a bit of a fear of abandonment, and I could use a little bit of reassurance. Or if you are going to be away for a bit, can you check in? So we ask for our needs, we talk about our core wounds, and now we're sharing our inner world with somebody. And that's a really beautiful part, from like the CNE, the core wounds, needs, emotional patterns, into our boundaries, our communication. And that communication allows that thriving to happen, where you can now understand my inner world and I can share that with you vulnerably, and vice versa. The dismissive avoidant learns to say, hey, when you need to communicate something to me, because sometimes we'll see, for example, in like the anxious, dismissive, anxious avoidant trap, we'll see anxious, preoccupied individuals can sometimes communicate from, because you're holding everything in, right? You're like, you don't want to, be a burden at all. So you won't say, I need support. And then instead you'll hold it in, and fearful avoidance do this too. And then it comes out as like, you never support me. And then dismissive avoidance are like, you're criticizing me. I'm defective. And then they shut down. And so we learn to, like, in that communication piece, learn to be vulnerable. Say, hey, I could really use some support. Or, hey, I miss you. I could use some quality time. Let's plan a date night. Like, so we learn to communicate in the positive instead of in the negative, because we were holding things in. And so, when we get to that communication piece, we're sharing our inner worlds. We're letting somebody know what's going on inside of us. And now we're getting to be loved without conditions, because we're sharing who we really are. And that's ultimately what allows us to progress out of power struggle into stability, commitment, and bliss stages of relationships.
Oh, okay. Stability, commitment, and then bliss.
Yes.
Are there any other rites of passage to move through those stages, or is that just a natural progression?
Part of it's a natural progression, but there definitely are rites of passage. So the dating stage rite of passage is like vetting, making sure that you're actually a fit. And unfortunately, so many people don't even do that stage properly.
They don't. They're just like, oh, you pick me, I'll pick you. Let's just do it together.
I think you're attractive and interesting. And so that's it. And exactly. And that's very limiting for people. And we pay for that later, unfortunately. Dismissive avoidance on one side, their vetting stage is usually flaw finding, right? Because they go into self-protection. So they'll be like, oh, wait, I just as I'm getting close to you, I'm going to push you away. And so they're doing like the opposite of vetting. They're vetting too much. And then anxious individuals tend to be more like, I see all the best in you. I put you on a pedestal. And then I just, the rose colored glasses are on, and then I forget about myself and my needs and that sort of thing. And then fearful avoidance are just hot and cold. They just go back and forth on both. So that's like the rite of passage for that. The honeymoon stage, generally when we move into the power struggle stage, the rite of passage becomes that we've been with somebody long enough that we start getting comfortable.
Yep.
So now we start like lowering the mask. And it's so funny because I would see this theme when I was working in client practice, because I had a big focus on relationships there. And people would come in and be like, Thais, oh my gosh, I met my wife. She was perfect. We got married quickly. We got married, a year and a half in, and she turned into a monster right after. She tricked me. Like, people would think these like really intense things. And what's actually happening is like, usually you're seeing the dating and honeymoon stage last about a year and a half to 2 years.
So they never went through the power struggle stage.
Exactly, before getting married.
Right.
So then all of a sudden they're like, this person like got me, or they're a monster and they were tricking. And it's like these very like, it was a very fearful avoidant type of thing to think, for sure. The betrayal part. But we get there through the comfort at about a year and a half.
Yeah.
And then our next rite of passage is that, like, let me get open, be vulnerable, get accepted. And then I move into stability. Stability is about that we really learn each other's patterns. So actually there's a really beautiful part to this stage, which is once you know someone's sensitivities to things, like I know, for example, so my husband works with us in our business.
Oh, amazing.
And we have a team of like about 30 people who work for PDS right now. And when I know that historically he had a sensitivity to criticism. Right now he's very secure for a long time, but I know that was like his thing. And so for me, like if I ever saw somebody be critical in a meeting or something like that, like I know without him saying anything to me to go check in, or to go like give him something that's acknowledging him or appreciating him, to kind of like, help with that criticism. Or, for me, he knows that if I ever have a dynamic where there's like a really big sudden shift in something, a big sudden change, that I'm like, oh, I have to reorganize everything. And I can't, that sort of like
feels disorienting.
Exactly. And so he knows to come be like, hey, let's plan together. And so the cool part about when you get into the stability stage is that you know each other without having to communicate. And so a lot of people will say early, like, doesn't all this communication take so much time? And it's like, yeah, but it saves you way more time from just being triggered. And then it saves you way more time later, because you actually like don't have to do all that work any longer. And so the stability, you're like solidifying that. And then the commitment rite of passage is you start having the conversations. Like, what do we want our future to be like? How many kids do we want to have? Where do we want to live? What are our patterns for how we want to raise children? You start having those deeper dialogues about things more intentionally. And then the bliss stage is sort of like the honeymoon stage, but with actually knowing each other.
Oh, yes. That's the end goal. And what's, I think, beautiful about that, and maybe tell me, is it possible to get to the bliss stage if you haven't achieved secure attachment in your relationships?
To be honest, Not really. It's really tough. I mean, I have yet to really see anybody who's truly in the bliss stage without achieving. And secure attachment doesn't have to be that like you take an attachment style test and you test 100%.
Of course.
It doesn't have to be that, but
It's
it has to
fluid.
be that like there's dominant secure attachment in there, because unfortunately when we don't have that, we just so easily get into a position where we like project our core wounds, or we don't communicate, or, you know, it's one of the sort of biggest like myths out there is that anxious preoccupieds are super emotionally available, and they are good at sharing themselves when they're triggered, but there's a lack of emotional availability when you're people pleasing somebody because your mask is on. And so when we're not really able to like share ourselves truly, there's still a block, and it's hard to like, we can kind of get into stability and then like kind of regress back and forth to power struggle. But until we at least have like a dominant secure attachment style, it's really hard to get into like the true bliss, because we're blocking, or there's all these obstacles from like being known, being seen, being able to share exactly when something's on our mind, or communicate through things and hash things out in real time.
Right.
And so all those things will act as barriers.
Yeah, but we're kind of unconsciously sabotaging the relationship. We don't even know, even though we're trying really hard and we're doing our best and we're putting forth what feels like a lot of effort at times, but we keep rubbing up against each other's wounding because we haven't done the work to heal that within relationship. And what I've learned, and I've said this a lot on the show, is that like our deepest wounds happen in relationships, but they're also healed in relationships.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
right?
One of my favorite lines ever is from this book called The Shack. I never even read the whole book.
I
read like
but I
part of
haven't
it.
either.
And
It's one of, I don't know if it's considered self-help. It was like a religious book, I think.
oh, was it?
I believe.
Okay.
So that would, Jim
Somebody-
Quick would say, Tori, that's self-help. That is not self-help, because I haven't read it.
Somebody bought it for me years ago, and I honestly read like the first 3 pages, and I don't like fiction. I think it was like a
Yeah.
story, and I was kind of like, oh, I'm not going to read it. But the first thing that got me, and what actually saved me, is I think the first line of that book was almost exactly what you just said, which is like most of our suffering comes through relationships, but so does most of our healing. And that always stuck with me. That's my takeaway from the book I never read.
Yeah, but it requires us to cross that threshold of true vulnerability so that we can have true intimacy, right? And intimacy, I love the way it's broken down. I can't remember who I heard this from the first time, which is intimacy is into me, you see. And so often some of my deepest suffering in relationships has come as a byproduct of meeting my partner mask to mask,
Yes.
not face to face.
Oh, I love that. That's
Right.
beautifully said.
And getting to a point where within yourself, you trust yourself enough to show your own face and be seen, but also that you've developed a relationship with someone who deserves has the right to see you and all of that too. And is really profound, but it's powerful to hear, this is the work we have to be fully responsible for if we want to get to what's possible in relationships, which is this like bliss stage, right? Which is possible. And I think a lot of people, sadly, and I sound old, like in this day and age, but like sadly in our culture, so many people have kind of just blown it off. It's like, oh, that doesn't exist, because so few people have examples of what that looks like in healthy partnership. But it doesn't mean it's not possible and real, and that there are people truly thriving in these relationships, in secure attachment. But it doesn't come as a byproduct of neglecting your own work.
100%. And I could not agree more with you about that. It's a little bit tragic, to be quite honest, because as somebody who grew up with a fearful avoidant attachment style, I grew up being like, I'm never getting married. I'm never having kids. I'm never, because I was scarred. And now like my relationship in my life is like one of the things I'm most grateful for. And it was an unknown to me. And I think that we are surrounded in a culture that's like, unfortunately too, there's a lot of advice out there that's like teaching people how to play games and how to like kind of control or like manipulate attention or things like that. And the craziest part about that is like, sure, that'll get you your attention in like the dating stage and honeymoon stage, and then you'll pay for it twofold in the power struggle stage.
Yep.
And so we get into this, and I know for me too, before I ever was in a relationship that made it out of the power struggle stage, I was only ever in dating, honeymoon, power struggle. So my whole perception was like, there's either the highs of the dating and honeymoon, or there's the chaos of the power struggle. And so as soon as I could feel the power struggle coming on, I'd jet, like I'd leave or run away. And so it's like, yeah, but that's not relationships. That's this one very small like season or chapter.
Mhm.
And then there's so much more later on into relationships that like we don't even realize that we have access to.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, a lot of the dating sort of discussions out there are like very divisive in that way.
Yeah. So what do you say to a couple who's in the power struggle stage and they feel like maybe this is the season they're fighting a lot or they're having a lot of really hard discussions and they're like, what do you say to the couples who are in that stage and they're trying to hold on, when do you know if it's time to jet and leave? And when do you know when it's time to hold on and really like commit to your own personal growth personally deeper on a deeper level, but also like that this is a season you just kind of have to bear and get through together. Like, am I not
You're
even
making
asking
perfect
it
sense.
right?
No, it's perfect. It's a
Okay.
great question. And the sort of answer is like when I would see in my practice, the number one thing I was looking for, to be quite honest, is I didn't care how much people had trauma. I didn't care how bad stuff was. I didn't care how much they had been through. I cared in the first session when I was sitting down with people, I was trying to assess, are both people willing to do the work?
Mhm.
That's it. And if both people are willing to like, because it's not easy to be vulnerable. We live in a world that like basically negatively reinforces vulnerability. And it's not easy to go in, like you said earlier, like we have to go through the pain to get the golden nuggets on the other side. And so if both people are willing to have those discussions, to do the reprogramming of the core wounds, to learn what their needs are and learn how to share them with each other, to do a little nervous system work as a habit in the morning, like if we're willing to like sink our teeth into those things, that's where we get the results from.
Mhm.
And that's what I was just looking for is, are both people willing? And the places that I would find would get stuck is if somebody was like, I'm just here because I'm being dragged here to couples counseling. I don't actually want to be, fully here. Then it would be like, okay, then I'm gonna do cost benefit work with them to try to leverage it. I'd be like, what are the costs of not doing the work? What are the benefits of doing the work? Try to like get in
So
there.
true.
But then if somebody was just unwilling, then, that's their sort of autonomy to choose.
Of course. No, that's a great way to help people orient and identify like, is this something that can potentially work
Yes.
long term? And if we're both on the same page and we're both committed to it, then yeah, you can absolutely work through almost anything if you've got
Yes.
two dedicated, committed people who
Absolutely.
are
And
showing up for themselves.
exactly. And I would say the one kind of exception would be sometimes people come in, this is rare, like maybe 1% of the time, but sometimes people come in and they would have been in a relationship for 2 years, 3 years where they had a non-negotiable. And that's what speaks to that early stage of vetting where like people really loved each other. They wanted to work, but one person wants kids, the other person for sure doesn't.
Mhm.
And those are non-negotiable things. And in that case, it's a deal breaker too.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. I've had friends who've gone through that exact scenario, and it's really painful to watch, and it's painful for them on the backside of things too. And I think it also is an encouragement to those who are in that dating stage to just really, really be honest with yourself and really be honest with the person that you're talking to or that you're dating, because although you wanted to make it work in the moment, it's like there is a part of you, if you have to betray your own truth to make it work, it won't work long term.
Beautifully said. And then you're the creator of a new core wound, because we like our core wounds are not just what's done to us, it's also what we do to ourselves. And so if we go into the I will betray my truth to be with somebody, then like we're gonna have a betrayal core wound, and that's gonna rear its head back in the relationship too.
Yeah, so true. Okay, this has been so full of really, really good, valuable insights and practical things people can do. I know you've written a book called Learning, Love, Build the Best Relationship of Your Life Using Integrated Attachment Theory. Tell me a little bit about it and what people can expect from the book. I know more of probably what we've discussed today, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Thank you. Yeah. So basically, it's a summary of integrated attachment theory. So what it does is I wrote a book a few years ago, just kind of like high level attachment theory, but this is actually going through the CNE BCB dynamics and teaching people like how to recognize their attachment style and then how to actually go through all the different steps, right? Like how to recondition their core wounds. There's a few tools, how to learn their needs, how to communicate their needs, how to emotionally regulate, goes through all of the boundaries, coping mechanisms, and it sort of summarizes everything there. And my goal for people is that I really want people to be able to get to the bliss stage of their relationships. I really want people to realize that like, hey, relationships and connection are not just dating, honeymoon, and then chaos of the power struggle, and then that's it, because we lose hope there. And then I think when people lose hope and lose empathy because they're feeling, in turmoil, then we think, well, what's the point? Like, who cares? Why bother? Just play the games and resort to sort of like the lesser parts of ourselves. So the whole book is designed to help people get past all these different stages or prepare themselves if they're single to get to the bliss stage in the future by doing that inner work and understanding their workings. And the last thing I'll say about it is that ultimately, all of the attachment style work is just the relationship to ourselves, right? Like that's the root. And if we can heal and improve that, the next parts come more naturally. The communication, because we back ourselves and we trust ourselves, we will communicate even if it's scary. So, those external parts are the result of doing that inner work first. And there's a lot of beauty in that as well. Beyond just the bliss stage of our external relationships, healing that relationship to ourselves is so valuable.
Yeah. I mean, just to get to a bliss stage of your relationship with self would be an epic relationship. It is the primary relationship you will have for the rest of your life. It is the only relationship you cannot get out of is the one with yourself. So it starts and it ends with you. Yeah. It really does. And you've given people such a powerful framework for how they can shift and really reprogram the subconscious, move into secure attachment, and create the relationships that they really desire. And this is the type of information and methodology that can then go not just be like learned about and heard about and talked about in class, but applied and see the real transformation that comes as a byproduct of that.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. This show is all about building lives and relationships that feel as good as they look. Because what's the point in curating a life and a relationship that looks really good and we go together and we dress, like we look like we go together and all the things if internally our world is in chaos and we're at war with ourselves or at war with our partner. And so I just want to say thank you for your commitment to doing your work on yourself, but also shining that light and illuminating the path for everybody else who's going to come after you. Because in order to create the more beautiful world that we all want to live in, it starts with us.
Absolutely. And I just want to say thank you to you because like you're doing such powerful work here, and hearing your story before we sat down to do this, I was like so inspired and just blown away. And I know that because you've done so much inner work, that's probably why you've had such success and are doing so much to share with others as well.
I appreciate it. Yeah. I just, like you, I realized that if I want to feel good then I've got to do the work on myself. I don't get to bypass the hard things, and my pain has just been a catalyst for my purpose. And that's what I get to do, is have fascinating conversations with people like you. And I'm so grateful that you took the time to be here today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So please tell people where they can find you online and how they can connect with you in the Personal Development School and get your book and all of those fun things.
Yes. So we have a free attachment style quiz on YouTube, personaldevelopmentschool.com, and then free daily content that we put on YouTube as well, which is Personal Development School Thais Gibson.
Amazing. We will put all of that information in the show notes. You know what we do. We make it so easy for you guys to access, connect with Thais so that you can build a relationship that feels amazing, so that you can take whatever relationship you're in right now, whether that's single, the relationship to yourself, or a romantic relationship that you want to see eventually get to the bliss stage. This is a framework that you can apply to your life. I hope that you won't just listen, but you will use it and watch it transform your relationships. Thank you guys for tuning in this week. We'll see you next week on the Coachable Podcast.